Imagine this. In Japan, many elders take part in a quiet but powerful tradition called shūkatsu, life-ending preparation. It's not grim, it's graceful. They carefully declutter while they are still alive, choosing what to keep, what to pass on, and what to release, so that their children inherit peace, not piles of confusion. This practice is a final gift of love, showing care even beyond one's lifetime. Now, think about the contrast here in the US. Too often, seniors leave behind garages stacked with boxes, attics stuffed with decades of belongings, or even costly storage units no one wants to sift through. Instead of harmony, families inherit stress, arguments, and the overwhelming burden of sorting through someone else's unfinished decisions. Let me ask you something deeply personal. If tomorrow came too soon, what would your family receive from you? Would it be a sense of peace, knowing everything is in order, or would it be a heavy burden, sorting through clutter that carries more confusion than clarity? It's a tough question, but it's one worth asking now, because the choices we make today can shape the memories and ease of those we love tomorrow. If you believe your home should be a gift, not a stress, tap that like button right now. It tells YouTube that this message matters, but more importantly, it's your first step toward a lighter life and a legacy of peace. And keep watching, because what I'm about to share may change the way you look at your belongings forever. Meet Haru Takemura, a 71-year-old retired gardener whose life bridges two very different worlds. Haru spent most of his life in Kyoto, Japan, surrounded by the quiet beauty of temple gardens and the rhythm of seasons that taught him patience and balance. When his beloved wife passed away 5 years ago, the silence in his home became unbearable. His daughter, who had moved to Ohio, invited him to live with her, and so Haru packed his life into a single suitcase. But here's the truth, what he carried wasn't just clothes or photographs. Inside that suitcase were two cultures, the Japanese wisdom of letting go gracefully and the American tendency to hold on, just in case. In Japan, Haru had grown up seeing elders practice dansheri, the mindful art of releasing what no longer serves you. He saw neighbors bow to their old coats before placing them in donation bins, whispering thank you as if to honor the service those items had given. He watched his own grandmother clear a small drawer each spring, believing that space in the home created space in the heart. These rituals were not acts of loss, they were acts of respect, a way of living lighter and leaving behind harmony for the next generation. But when Haru arrived in America, he saw something different. His daughter's garage was lined with plastic bins stacked to the ceiling. Closets overflowed with clothes unworn for decades. Friends his age admitted they rented storage units, paying month after month to keep things they hadn't touched in years. Haru realized he was now living in a culture where holding on was a sign of security, even if the weight of those possessions quietly drained peace and energy. This contrast struck Haru deeply. For him, decluttering had never been about discarding life. It had been about choosing carefully which pieces of life deserved to continue with him. Each object carried meaning, but not all meaning was meant to last forever. His suitcase became a symbol. Every item inside it had been chosen intentionally, stripped down to what mattered most. To Haru, this wasn't minimalism in the trendy sense, it was legacy. It was preparing his home, his mind, and his family for clarity, not chaos. As Haru settled into his daughter's home, he began to teach her what he had learned from Japan, that letting go can be a ritual, not a rush, that simplicity doesn't erase memory but sharpens it, and that legacy is not built on the piles we leave behind, but on the peace we create for those who love us. For Haru, decluttering was never about emptiness, it was about fullness of life, lived with purpose and passed on with dignity. Mistake 1. Emotional hoarding instead of honoring. For many elders, the heaviest clutter isn't stacked in boxes but stitched into the heart. Haru Takemura, 71, felt it each time he unfolded a small bundle at the back of his drawer, his late wife's soil-stained gardening gloves. The leather held the faint scent of rain and fertilizer, and the creases formed where her fingers had pressed tulip bulbs into the Kyoto earth. He told himself the gloves were comfort, a way to keep her close, yet every glance returned him to the moment of parting, fixing grief in place like a pinned moth. The drawer became a shrine of ache, not a source of peace, and the rest of the room arranged itself around that quiet weight. Haru had grown up with dansheri, the Japanese practice of releasing what no longer serves life. He remembered his grandmother preparing a kimono for farewell, brushing the fabric smooth, folding it along remembered seams, and placing it briefly in the tokonoma alcove as if the garment deserved one final place of honor. She bowed and murmured arigat, thanking not cloth but years, the festivals, the winters, the ordinary mornings. That memory returned to him in Ohio, far from temple bells, when he realized the gloves had shifted from symbol to tether. To honor his wife, he needed to choose living memory over embalmed evidence. On an evening when the cicadas sang against the window screen, Haru brewed sencha, lit a small candle, and wrote a short letter. For the harvests we shared, for roses that climbed the fence, for the way your laugh loosened the soil of difficult days, thank you. He set the letter beneath the gloves, held them one last time, and felt the overlap of tenderness and resolve. Release, he understood, did not erase, it refined. Like kintsugi, which fills a crack with gold, the act of letting go lined the fracture with meaning instead of hiding it. In the weeks that followed, the drawer lost its gravity and the room inhaled. Haru kept one photograph, his wife in a wide hat, sleeves rolled, squinting at a stubborn root, and he planted a rose in the Ohio yard that matched her favorite Kyoto variety. That rose became a living archive, petals opening on new mornings, scent drifting into future summers. The memory moved from object to ritual, from storage to garden. Across oceans, it is easy to confuse preservation with devotion, to stack proof upon proof that love existed. But multiples dilute memory, and certain items, however tender, can calcify sorrow. Haru found that honoring meant carrying the person forward in actions and stories, not in brittle relics that demanded daily grief. When neighbors asked about the rose, he told them her name, her jokes, the way she never followed planting diagrams. The story breathed, the gloves were no longer required to keep it alive. By choosing to honor rather than hoard, Haru did not close a chapter, he rewrote its ending to include light. A drawer opened without a sting, a garden bloomed without an anchor of pain, and the house felt less like a museum and more like a home. Memory, he learned, grows best when given air, not when sealed in a dark space and guarded by fear. Mistake 2, saving just-in-case supplies forever. The first week in Ohio, Haru opened a kitchen drawer and met the American emergency kit of ordinary life. A tangle of rubber bands, a drift of twist ties, jar lids without jars, and a soft avalanche of grocery bags compressed like a coiled spring. His daughter laughed, "They're useful." And Haru smiled, hearing an echo of his younger self. Years earlier in Kyoto, he had kept spare nails, bent screws, and short scraps of cedar for a birdhouse he never built. Just in case had felt practical, even prudent. In practice it behaved like ivy, creeping across shelves until the room was held by what might be, not what is. Japan taught him the eloquence of empty space and the duty objects have to coexist with breath and movement. His grandfather's tools lived in a single wooden box. A surplus was considered indelicate, like speaking too loudly in a quiet room. The elders he knew kept extras within a single furoshiki wrap, defined not by scarcity but by sufficiency. The limit acted as a teacher. When the wrap grew tight, it asked a question: which items truly support today's life? Haru set the Ohio drawer on the table and, without sermon, began to sort by truth rather than fear. One cloth bag with strong handles stood up to errands on its own. 3 rubber bands held the few things that ever needed bundling. One sturdy jar actually welcomed leftovers. As the rest left the surface, recycled, donated, released, the drawer took a full breath. Space appeared, and with it a new sensation in the room: ease. The next morning his daughter opened that drawer to find not a puzzle but a ready hand. The small dignity of reaching for one dependable thing replaced the anxious rummage for a maybe. He recognized how just in case had disguised a quieter anxiety, the worry that the future would not provide, that a small shortage would become a crisis. Yet in Kyoto, convenience stores glowed at every corner. In Ohio, helpful neighbors and nearby shops formed a similar net. Preparedness, he realized, is not measured by bulk but by clarity. A drawer of 50 plastic bags hides the one that works. A shelf of jars with no lids is inventory masquerading as security. As days passed, the house seemed to exhale. Cabinets closed without a shove. counters held a visible invitation to cook or to rest a cup of tea. Haru noticed his own shoulders dropping when he entered the kitchen, a physiological proof that space heals. He thought of a no stage, so much open floor that each gesture gains meaning, and felt the kinship between theater and the humble drawer. Remove the noise so action can speak. When a storm swept through the neighborhood, the simplified system held. The single reliable flashlight waited where it should, not buried under a nervous pile of almosts. Just in case, Haru understood, had been stealing his daughter's attention one rummage at a time. Now attention returned to the meal, the conversation, the evening. Balance came not from building a fortress of scraps but from trusting that an intentional home is better armor than a cluttered one. Mistake 3. Holding onto someday items. Behind the Kyoto house sat a shed that was supposed to be a workshop. Over the years it became a gallery of intention. Cedar offcuts leaned like books, jars of screws rattled with mismatched threads, and a half-assembled shūkatsu screen waited for Haru to master a joint he had never learned. Someday, he told himself, locking the door with the tenderness of a promise. Seasons turned. The wood cupped and split, the paper yellowed, the word someday hardened into a fence between desire and doing. Japan names the sorrow of waste motenai, but Haru came to see that waste does not happen at the moment of release, it happens in the slow abandonment of function. Tools that never touch work grow lonely. He remembered Mr. Sakamoto, an elderly takumi, a craftsperson, who could coax a bent chisel back to purpose. One afternoon Haru carried the shūkatsu frame to Sakamoto's shop. The old man ran a thumb along the mortise, nodding at what still could be, and traded the frame for a lesson. In the barter, Haru felt a door open. Unused objects wanted circulation, not captivity. Later, in Ohio, he found echoes of that shed in garages filled with elliptical machines that became coat racks, closets harboring suits 2 sizes from the present, and knitting baskets whose yarn held the perfume of years without a stitch. He recognized in himself the tenderness that keeps us from admitting a chapter has closed. But he also saw the tax it exacts. Every square foot pledge to someday evicts the simple pleasures of now, a chair by the window, a table cleared for letters, the freedom to move without apologizing to a pile. One Saturday, Haru opened his own American someday box, a bundle of bonsai wire, a dull grafting knife, clippers with a sprung spring. He laid them on the porch and asked a more generous question than, "Will I use you again? Where will you most likely be used?" The answer drew him to a community garden, where a younger neighbor had been coaxing tomatoes through Midwestern clay. The clippers clicked again in new hands, the wire-trained vines that were hungry for guidance. The knife found its sharpness against an honest task. Haru returned home carrying less and feeling wealthier, as if he had cashed in a currency that had quietly depreciated. In the empty space left behind, he set a small writing desk. Letters to old friends began to appear. A map of Ohio attracted red threads to places he and his daughter might visit. The shed of intention had transformed into a room of action, not by force but by a change in allegiance. From the future he kept promising to the present that kept inviting him. Someday, he learned, is the most crowded day on the calendar. Today is the one that can still breathe. Sometimes, on cool evenings, he walks past the community plots and sees his former tools at work. The sight does not sting. It confirms what his culture had taught him and what his life kept proving. Circulation honors the object and the owner alike. A life unclogged by deferred projects gains momentum, and momentum feels like youth returning in quieter, more honest form. Mistake 4. Avoiding legacy decluttering. When Haru's father died, the family gathered in a tatami room that smelled of straw and cedar. On the floor sat a single wooden chest wrapped in a faded indigo furoshiki. The label read, in neat brushstrokes, "For my children." Inside, a watch that had measured decades of punctual kindness, a photo album slim enough to finish in an afternoon, a letter to each child, and the address of a neighbor who had agreed to accept the remaining books for the village library. The grief was clean. There were tears, yes, but not the panic of logistics, not the ache of sorting 1,000 undecided objects while the loss was still raw. That experience became Haru's private definition of love prepared. Shūkatsu for life-ending preparation was not a morbid practice in his family, it was hospitality extended into the future. Years later, in Ohio, he heard friends speak in low voices about storage units that swallowed pensions, about siblings who stopped speaking because 3 boxes had no labels, about an attic that felt like a storm waiting for a date. The contrast rattled him. A legacy, he thought, should be lighter than a life, not heavier. Haru began gently. He wrote names on index cards and tucked them under a few items whose stories were strong. The teacup with a hairline of gold kintsugi where his wife had cracked it laughing, the small pruning shears with his initials worn soft by summer. He recorded the tale of each object in a notebook, where it came from, why it mattered, who might welcome it next. He spoke to his daughter not as executor but as companion, walking room by room, telling the family myths that objects often hold hostage. What remained without narrative or need, he released, sometimes after a small bow, sometimes after a quiet chuckle at his own former attachments. He also made something new, a slim, deliberate box labeled "Open when I am gone." Inside, he placed the watch his father had worn, his own letter, a handful of photographs, the key to a folder of digitized albums, and a list with 2 columns, keep, pass. The list was short on purpose, brevity was part of the gift. He imagined his daughter opening the box and finding not a task but a conversation that could continue without him. During Obin, they lit incense on the patio and spoke aloud the names of those who had made them possible. In that glow, Haru explained the choices he had made, the keepsakes he wanted near her, and the freedom he hoped she would feel to let the rest flow away. The ritual moved the topic from dread to gratitude. Death stepped out of the closet and sat politely at the table, where it could be planned for with the same calm as planting spring peas. By choosing clarity over postponement, Haru did more than tidy, he tuned his home like an instrument. He gave his daughter the gift his father had given him, the chance to mourn without sorting, to remember without resenting, to step into the future carrying stories instead of boxes. And in that preparation he found his own relief, as if a knot he had not known was there finally loosened. Mistake 5. Confusing memories with multiples. On a shelf in Ohio stood 40 albums that had crossed the ocean in scanned form and then, bit by bit, reaccumulated as prints and duplicates. Haru would reach for an album and hesitate. Too many spines, too many similar covers, too much decision packed into what should have been simple tenderness. The abundance blurred into a fog. Paradoxically, the more he owned, the less he visited the past with care. Japanese tea ceremony taught him, one meeting, one moment, unrepeatable. A single bowl, a single sip, the full attention of everyone present. This is how significance is made. Haru applied that ceremony to remembrance. He spent evenings at the table choosing a single photograph from a dozen nearly the same, selecting not the sharpest image but the one that contained breath, his wife mid-laughter, his daughter's hair flying, a smudge on the lens that somehow made the scene honest. He ordered a slim book with these choices and retired the rest to a digital archive that could be visited but did not demand shelf space. The effect was immediate. The chosen album invited touch, the pages turned like conversation. When friends visited, they finished the story in one sitting and then told their own. The old mountain of albums had asked for a commitment of hours and ended in fatigue. The curated book made room for joy to complete its arc. Haru felt something else as well. The house grew quieter, as if the photographs, freed from redundancy, spoke in a clear voice rather than a chorus that never found harmony. He carried the same lesson into other corners. Vacation mugs dwindled to one with a chip that recalled a comic stumble at a ferry dock. Sweaters thinned to the cardigan that still held the faint resin of cedar chests in Kyoto. The reduction did not narrow memory, it etched it. Multiplicity, he realized, is often a strategy to avoid choosing. And avoiding choosing is how meaning is diluted. When he handed his daughter one framed image instead of a box labeled "Mom, Photos," she placed it on the mantel without delay. It did not wait for a perfect wall or a future afternoon. It entered the life of the house instantly, where glances could catch it and stories could catch fire. The rest of the copies, scanned and safe, became accessible without insisting on physical sovereignty. In paring down, Haru was not erasing history, he was shaping it. He became, in his own small way, an editor of a family archive, trusting that depth beats breadth when the goal is love remembered, not proof displayed. In that trust, he felt closer to the people in the pictures, not because there were fewer images, but because the remaining ones finally had room to breathe. Mistake 6. Staying silent about clutter. Silence had always masqueraded as politeness in conversations about possessions. In Kyoto, Obon interrupted that habit. Lanterns lit, graves tended, families gathered not only to honor ancestors but to retell what should endure and to admit what could be let go. As a boy, Haru listened while elders negotiated gently, the tea caddy to a niece who loved ceramics, the fishing rod to a nephew who woke early for rivers, the rest to neighbors who might put them to use. The talk was not morbid, it was affectionate choreography, a way of helping love find future addresses. Ohio households, he noticed, often postponed that dance. "We'll sort it later," floated above holiday dinners like a harmless balloon. Later arrived as a thundercloud, after illness, after a move, after a death, and the room filled with the noise of cardboard and conflict. Haru could feel the tension at friends' kitchen tables, siblings translating silence into accusation, spouses translating indecision into verdicts. He did not want his daughter to inherit a riddle where a blessing should be. So he boiled water, warmed the teapot, and called a small meeting that was more tea than meeting. On the table he placed a few significant objects and the notebook of stories he had been keeping. They did not begin with a list, they began with memory, where each thing had lived and why it mattered. The atmosphere softened. Decisions followed the narrative like a stream follows gravity. Items found their destinations through recognition, not debate. Where no story or use appeared, laughter sometimes did, and laughter is a solvent as effective as any cleaner. Haru noticed how speaking turned weight into motion. A pair of lacquer chopsticks became a promise to host New Year's soup together. A weathered hat became an invitation to walk the metroparks every spring. In voicing intent, they also voiced permission, to keep, to pass, to release without guilt. The unspoken had been heavy, the spoken became light enough to carry forward. He watched his daughter absorb the method without naming it. Weeks later she started a conversation of her own, asking about the books, the tools, the quilts. The house began to narrate itself in real time, reducing the chance that it would become a puzzle for someone else to solve. Haru acknowledged to himself that this was perhaps the bravest decluttering of all, not the lifting of boxes but the lifting of a pause that had lasted years. By replacing silence with story, the home learned to settle into a shape that matched the family's living, not its fears. The result was not only fewer things but cleaner ties, less anxiety, more laughter, and the knowledge that love would not have to dig through cardboard to find its way. Mistake 7. Treating decluttering as a one-time chore. The calendar in Kyoto taught Haru that life is a circle, not a line. At year's end, families practice a deep clean that is less scrubbing than renewal, sweeping out dust so the new year does not inherit the old year's stagnation. Other turns of the season invite lighter versions, closets rotated when plum blossoms open, drawers reconsidered when cicadas begin their refrain. In that cadence, discarding is not drama, it is upkeep, like trimming a bonsai so light can find the inner leaves. In Ohio, he first encountered a different rhythm, long calm punctuated by crisis. Closets yawned for years and then exploded, garages slept and then demanded a weekend siege with rented dumpsters and sore backs. The pattern left everyone exhausted and slightly sorrowful, as if the house had staged an uprising. Haru suspected the house wanted something gentler, attention in sips, not gulps. He began with what the garden had taught him, touch everything often. Once a month he wandered with a small cloth bag, not hunting but noticing. A cookbook he hadn't opened since the move went to a neighbor who hosted block parties. A scarf that kept slipping from his shoulders returned to a thrift store where someone else might wear it with more grace. The practice felt more like conversation than culling. Some months the bag remained almost empty, other months it brimmed with things that had quietly finished their service. As the habit settled, the home changed texture. Drawers slid without resistance. The hallway echoed a little, not emptiness, but clarity. He found he had time to sit and practice shod, brush calligraphy, because the table no longer required a half-hour of prelude to clear. When company came unexpectedly, hospitality was simple. There was always a chair, there was always a surface for tea. Nothing had been staged, It had merely been kept available by 1,000 small choices. Seasons layered meaning onto the ritual. In spring he released tools he hadn't touched since last bloom. In summer he reconsidered bowls and plates as gatherings shifted outdoors. In autumn he thinned coats to those that met the new climate honestly. In winter he let go of books he knew he would not reread, making room for letters and quiet. The house began to keep time with the maple outside, and Haru felt the old Kyoto rhythm humming inside a Cleveland zip code. He noticed something else. The fear of regret faded when parting became ordinary. Parting in large batches encourages drama. Parting in small, seasonal gestures encourages discernment. By the time a year had turned, nothing loomed. Renewal had replaced rescue as the home's governing story. The chore had dissolved into a practice, the practice into a pleasure, and the pleasure into a way of blessing the days left, each made lighter by what no longer needed to be carried. Haru's home no longer feels like a museum of unfinished chapters. It feels alive, breathing, and welcoming. The heavy drawers, the cluttered corners, the silent weight of someday objects have all given way to a calmer rhythm of life. Each room reflects not only tidiness but also intention, carrying the warmth of stories without the burden of excess. His spirit has followed the same path, lighter, freer, and deeply at peace. What once felt like carrying two cultures, the American tendency to hold on and the Japanese practice of letting go, has resolved into a balance that serves him and his family in harmony. The change didn't happen in a single weekend or through a frenzy of tossing things away. It unfolded slowly, like a garden cultivated over time. Haru learned to honor memories without clinging, to trust the present without hoarding, and to prepare his legacy with clarity rather than confusion. He discovered that every act of release was not an act of loss but an act of love. Love for his wife's memory, love for his daughter's future, and love for his own peace of mind. His journey is proof that decluttering is not about stripping life bare, it is about allowing life to shine without obstruction. Japanese culture taught him that objects carry energy, and when they outlive their role, they should be thanked and set free. In embracing this wisdom, Haru showed that decluttering after 60 is not about living with less, it's about living with harmony. Harmony between past and present, between memory and freedom, between what we keep and what we release. By aligning his home with this balance, Haru created a sanctuary where laughter returns easily, where stories can be told without being buried under piles, and where his daughter feels joy rather than dread about the future. Imagine walking through your own home with that same sense of ease. No piles waiting in the attic, no boxes demanding attention in the garage, no secret guilt tucked into drawers. Instead, every corner offering space for conversation, for comfort, for peace. This is the heart of Haru's transformation. He realized that his true legacy wasn't in objects but in the atmosphere he left behind. The gift of clarity, the gift of freedom, the gift of love expressed through simplicity. And now the question rests with you. What story will your home tell after you are gone? Will it speak of confusion and clutter, or will it whisper of care, thoughtfulness, and harmony? The choice is yours to begin today. If Haru's journey inspired you, tap like. Share this with a friend over 60 who deserves peace. And subscribe to Wise Aging Seniors, because your legacy should feel like a gift, not a weight.